Oké, ja, als iemand klein is, dan dat we hem hier zetten.
Nee, ik bedoel meer dat je even vraagt of ze de webcam zelf een beetje omhoog kunnen verstellen. Terwijl daar blijft staan.
Oké.
Dat, ja, anders het.
Ik ga foto's maken van de stream, dan gaan die online.
Ga een foto maken van?
Van dit. Dan kan ik dat online gooien.
Oh ja, top. Nou goed, ik ga bij Elwang zitten.
Dus,
Hey, succes Jesse.
Ja.
Topper.
ik ben live. Als je de link wil, ik ben op dit moment motion en zo aan het invullen.
Can you maybe stop streaming
Oh.
and then change the name and then start streaming again? Because now it's streaming over the last one. Or as an addition to the last one.
I gave it a different name.
Okay.
So it should.
It still says round 9.
Okay, I'm going to change that.
Check that, and otherwise you need to stop and start again.
Okay.
Sorry. Wat? Komt omdat jij met je syphilis hebt gelegen. Oké, so you're the team, right? Ja.
Hi everyone, welcome to the open partial double octo round. In opening government we had USUE, in opening position we had USUC, closing government we had LEIDEN A, and in closing opposition we had UDUA. If we could go through the teams and have everyone introduce themselves, that would be great. Opening government.
I'm Alex, preferred pronouns she or they.
I'm James, he or they.
Imogen, she.
Gigi, she.
Emma, she or they.
Will.
Julia, she or they.
Okay, cool. I believe there's a quick announcement to be made about recording of this debate.
Yes, if any speaker would rather not be filmed or be recorded, please tell me now.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay.
Sorted.
I made vomit in my scripts.
Okay, cool. The motion is this House believes that countries close to conflict zones should only grant long-term asylum to refugees who agree to 1 year military service. I'd now like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the case for side government.
More than a third of the Jordanian population is now refugees. The reality of the way that conflicts work at the moment is that the burden of hosting those refugees is incredibly asymmetrical, incredibly disproportionately focused amongst people who are near countries that are near that conflict zone. What we're going to propose in today's debate is something that actually addresses that asymmetry, that allows countries that host huge numbers of refugees to create some kind of a beneficial, mutually mutual relationship that allows refugees to contribute and form a better part of that society. cannon fodder, that they will be met with resentment, that they won't be seen as part of a nationalist movement to bring strength to their country, but rather that now the already resented refugees are breaking into the army and are a liability to this new state. Because it only takes one instance of a refugee doing something wrong, one instance of them not even defecting, but doing something like failing to do their duty in a way which is seen as a spark of mutiny, to mean that there is massive backlash in a way which is unprecedented in regions like Jordan. The first question I'm going to ask in this speech is how the opening government's proposition will change the refugees' place in new society. And as I just said in my introduction, all of the material about them being marginalised does not say that the army will fix it, but rather suggests that that marginalisation will then be implanted into the army. Because it is not just about whether or not you merge the battalions by race, it is about how those individuals are treated within the battalion, and there is no suggestion from opening government of why there would be a change in that. First, whether or not the army is seen as a nationalist pursuit. Opening government wants to tell you that often this is something that people join around, that it's inclusionary, and that instances like Jordan, you see the royals partaking. That is a reason to think that the army is something highly prized, not a reason to think it is something that refugees will be welcomed into. We would argue that in instances where the resentment is as high as opening government would claim, people would not like the idea of defectors of a certain state going back to fight in that state. And even if they are not literally fighting, which we think would often be the case, you can obviously still see the general way which refugees would be portrayed, because if you are, for instance, organising a transport envoy and then something happens to that transport envoy, it would be easy to spark confusion or spark suspicion about how a refugee was involved in that. Similarly, if you're looking at things like handing out food to soldiers, again, it would only take one refugee to be questioned as a part of that, that would be likely that there would be huge resentment around that. The fact it is a nationalist pursuit actually suggests that it would be significantly harder for refugees to be able to be respected in that, rather than something like we would support, which would be them, say, taking on low-paid jobs and therefore being able to be seen, like they currently are in Jordan, as an important part of the economy, building it back up, taking jobs that would otherwise not be taken by citizens, and therefore becoming part of a national project which is crafted around and inclusive of refugees, rather than refugees being inserted into a place where they don't necessarily belong. Secondly, on whether or not it creates interaction. First point, as I've said previously, putting people in close proximity does not mean they get along. See, for example, most racism within countries. They wanted to say that Vietnam was a great example of race relations. The obvious difference is that in Vietnam, white American soldiers were not fighting against African Americans. Contrast that to Turkish refugees, where they will be fighting against people who are seen by the nationalist Turkish quite likely as the same as those refugees, which is likely to spark the resentment, which is likely to spark all of that. Finally, on giving employment, as we said, we would be happy to support employment programs for refugees in other sectors of the economy. We think that putting people from a conflict zone, which, as we said, are likely to have high rates of PTSD, are likely to have seen truly abhorrent things, is not a good form of employment for them individually, and is unlikely to spark this idea that they are working towards something. The final thing to note at the end of this point is that it is not clear to us why these refugee camps cease to exist. It is in fact likely that they would cease to exist in an even stronger capacity, because now you need to get them to agree to the deal. You are likely to be biased towards accepting people who will fight in the army, because even if they say children don't have to, if Turkey or Jordan has constructed their military around accepting refugees, they are obviously going to prioritise people who can fight in that army, and it is likely to get worse, because now it is even more important that you ideologically vet them so that instances of mutiny or instances of defection are less likely, and that is likely to cause even harsher things. Because we still think that there is a significant risk that they will defect, and it only takes one or two for that to be a disaster for refugees' place in society. Because they wanted to say the military has tactics to keep people loyal. Those are tactics such as spurring on nationalism, which, if you are being forced to join an army and feel you are being used as cannon fodder, is unlikely to be particularly compelling to you when you have seen an army be used against you your entire life. This is similarly the reason why the deputy PM substantive doesn't really stand up, because
this idea that you would suddenly feel part of a nationalist project or that you would have a purpose in life, it is unclear why these people necessarily would want to fight or would want to be the part of a purpose of protecting their new state. Because it is not true that everyone who flees a country like Syria was part of political opposition. It is probably true that they were fearing bombs, they do not care who those bombs are for, and they feared for their life. They are not going to be happy when they are forced to fear for their life again in a way which they cannot contemplate and they do not think is fair. Closing.
There's currently an overrepresentation of crime in refugee camps in Lebanon. How are you going to get the integration that you so care so much about?
Yeah, we told you we'd support things like special economic zones for refugees. We'd support things like potentially like lower wages if that was necessary. That is not ideal. We think that is better than forcing them to put their life on a line for a country which has not accepted them. As I also said, they are actually likely to stay in refugee camps longer when you're not just vetting them for a country, but you're also vetting them for military service, as I said earlier in my speech. This is also why the region destabilised. We don't think you should be arming people with huge numbers of PTSD. We don't think that you should be sending them off to a conflict that they have likely fled in the first instances. We think that for that, and as we said in our Prime Minister's speech, this makes fleeing a region far worse, because even if Jordan is not involved in the war in Syria, Syria now knows that everyone who flees Syria is making Jordan stronger, and for that reason they are likely to treat defectors and treat people who flee far harsher. But all of this pales in comparison into the fact that it is not right and it is not fair to force people to join an army so that they can flee a safe area. And we do not care if you cannot have a perfect world. This is abhorrent and something that no country can stand for. It's not only that countries like Jordan now have done this abhorrent thing, it's the fact that it bleeds to countries like the US or countries like Canada or Australia or New Zealand, when now refugees are purely a way to make your country better and are purely something to be used in ways that you would never, that we do not support any citizen or any person being used in, and for that reason we're proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech. We now turn to the closing part of the debate, so I'd like to welcome the leaders on side government.
People get up for soldiers in the bus in Israel because they are proud, because the degree of respect that they feel for those people is unequivalent to any other respect they feel. People in Israel think that the Druze, a small minority in Israel, are important people for their country because they know that the units that are in are known as the most invested units in the army. We don't think this debate is only about contributing in any way. We think specifically military service means integration on a level that is that you're basically unable to reach in any other way. Given that both sides of this debate are going to grant asylum to some and not to others, what we're going to do is the following. We're going to explain that the number of people that we would accept under either side of the House, those people would be treated far better under side government. Those people get actual meaningful chances of life under our side of the House. Proud to propose for those reasons. Basically one big thing in my speech, why specifically military service facilitates the most valuable form of integration, not only in terms of contributing, but especially in terms of the unit that you are in, the fear that you face together, the hierarchy that armies have to deal with, and how that translates into meaningful integration. 2 points of response separately. Opening opposition says that refugees would be seen as a threat after only one case of misconduct. So note, the context that they have to deal with is those same refugees in refugee camps. Note that they are faceless under their side of the House. Note that any kind of misconduct that happens under their side of the House is heavily overreported. That's why we know of every single person and how they look like when they commit a crime in a refugee camp, but have no idea about the others. So note, they have to deal with that same context under their side of the House as well. We're unsure why ours would be worse. More importantly, we think if any side of this debate has good examples of refugees with faces, it's probably under side government, where you are in a unit with someone who you actually know the name of, who you know has gone through the same things as you have, who's been through the horrible circumstances and you went through it together. Under their side of the House, you have no way to interact with people in the camps. You only know the faceless people, or you have no idea about the faceless people that do well. You only know about the bad ones. They tell you, we can give an alternative in giving jobs. Firstly, we're unsure how the resources exist to employ 1/3 of Lebanon, given that they are all refugees. More importantly, deal with the context in which they're not getting jobs because no one is willing to employ them, because they don't think the resources are worth being spent on refugees. That means that they have no jobs under their side of the house. There's no actual other way to reintegrate. Secondly, they tell you that there's no guarantee that they be effective in the army because of language, because of loyalty. So they might just not contribute at all. Firstly, we have no reason to assume that they would overcome those same barriers under their side of the house, right? So if that is true, they would also be seen for those exact same reasons as non-contributing under their side of the house. More importantly, they also make choices about what refugees they want to let in and which ones they don't, which means if you think it's unfair that you wouldn't let in, I don't know, children because they couldn't contribute in the army, we think it's probably even more unfair that they are only letting in the ones that are most economically viable in the status quo. We think that's probably only means they're facilitating those people that need it less under their side of the house more than we are. Right. Opening government talks about why it's important for people to feel like refugees are contributing, how working is perceived as contributing, and therefore this is seen as a contribution. We think the military service is different. We think that it means some kind of contribution that is that you are unable to create, or that perception about it you are unable to create in another way. 4 reasons why we think that is true. Firstly, note, armies basically work within a strong hierarchy, right? Everyone who is in one layer of the army is considered equally valuable and equally respected, right? Irrespective of who you are then respected for that name and function. You wear the same kind of uniform, you have the same kind of position. It means that if you still think that citizens would respect anyone in the army, they're then far more unable to not respect someone who is a refugee with the same function, right? Because if you respect someone who does job X, then another person doing the exact same job mixed with the person you already respected would probably deserve the same kind of respect. We think that means that people are far more likely to be able to identify refugees as similar to them, right? As humans, just like they are as humans that they can see as the same as people that they already respected. Secondly, that is especially true in armies, right? Where you face together situations of existential fear that you would otherwise never face. The people that are in your units with you together, you need to know 100% sure that you can trust them in any other situation. It means that you need to train through it. That if you think you are biased and don't think you can trust someone in your unit, you will work through it before you go to a situation of war, because you know that when you are there, you need to depend on them. It means that you go through the situation before, that you know that you go into a unit and you trust basically everyone. You need to be sure of each other like nowhere else in the army. We think that means that people are far more likely to invest in each other and actually get to know each other and feel like equals. Thirdly, we think people that go into units in armies are often connected even far after they go out of the military, right? Those are people that you've been through hell with together. Those are still human beings that you know and are the same as you 40 years later. Importantly, it means this, right? Even if you think integration is likely to happen to some extent on either side of the house, even if there's some way that interaction would happen on our side of opposition, you are unsure that those bonds would still exist 30 years later, where people aren't in the army anymore. It means that people are still invested in each other under our side of the house 40 years later, where maybe refugees can say, you know how we were the same 40 years ago and now I'm unable to get a job. Those are people that you were then invested in. Those are people that you actually want to get same opportunities as you, whereas underside opposition, those are people you might want to give food to at some point, but they're in no way as deserving as your family. We think these are reasons that people would invest in each other far more than under side opposition. It means that people get actual opportunities to integrate. I'll talk about that more first opening.
Refugees are more likely to be respected in a business than an army, because the latter involves them fighting against rebel groups which they are unsympathetic and triggering problems like PTSD. While an army that distrusts refugees place them in the same units, rather than separating them in different units and denying them the training that other soldiers receive.
They don't go into business under your side of the house. They don't get the jobs under your side of the house. We think people are less willing to go into the army than go into a business function that you would get respect with. It means that refugees are outcompeted in business where they aren't outcompeted in the army. It means that you don't get any of those positions of respect, and we get them on a far larger scale. What are the impacts of all of this? Firstly, note, it's hugely important to consider what happens in 40 years, because those are the times in which you actually want to meaningfully make use of the long-term asylum that you've given, right? If people after 40 years don't get jobs, but also no one cares about them because they are still faceless as they were before, there's no way in improving their lives ever, right? That's why people 70 years after the fact still don't have citizenship in Lebanon as Palestinian refugees, because no one knows them. They don't matter to them. They're not part of their history. They're not part of their lives. We get far more of that. But secondly, we also think the resources and the availability of resources are far more likely to be happen on a larger scale on our side of the house. Where under side opposition, those are people that you are competing with, but you don't care about them. They're not your friends. They don't have the same kind of experiences as you have. Under our side of the house, those are people that you recognize as your own. They are people that are your friends and that are equally deserving to you. That means that even if you think the business and like integration programs that they want to talk about are the only way forward, you get them under our side of the house, where you don't get them under side opposition. For those reasons, propose.
Good to go? Alright. The reason there are refugees from South Sudan, from the Central African Republic, and from Syria is that those states treat those refugees' lives and whether they matter as a contingent fact before they consider whether those refugees are owed rights and care and security. They ask what their ethnic background is. They ask what their religion is. They don't think those people are owed anything in virtue of their humanity or in virtue of the borders in which they reside, but they ask questions of their own self-interest first and their own ethnic identification first. That contingent basis for what those people are owed and what their agency, whether their agency matters, is obviously repugnant. Now note that that same mechanism and that same contingent relationship of value applies in the government team's proposal. The question of whether a long-run asylum seeker matters is fixed and determined by whether or not they're capable of pulling a trigger or throwing a grenade or integrating somehow into the military. So crucially, note that that obviously excludes the wide range of people, some of whom have PTSD from being a refugee, some of whom are too old or too young or too sick from years of not getting health care because they weren't cared about in the country from which they came, from contributing. So those refugees obviously don't meet the filtering condition that motivates this motion. That is obviously repugnant, and our front half was right to point that out. But there are further implications for integration about this that I want to talk about. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the reciprocity of burdens in integration. Then I'm going to talk about how that principled fact, no thank you, actually moderates against the success of long-run integration. Before I do that, I want to very quickly talk about the comparative that OG and their back half have accepted in this round, and why I think it's mistaken. So crucially, they misunderstand the broader migratory patterns that change as a result of this radical sort of shift. So when they say the comparative is that, like, we live in a world where all the same refugee and asylum seeking happens, and like now they live in one where you get a few more people in, that is obviously unfair, right? Because there are a number of people who we think, given this self-interested model of military service requirement, now don't get into the countries in the first place. Right? Many people who don't think they can do this are likely to stay and not leave. Many more people also, I think, who may be able to do this but don't want to, are going to take illicit channels of getting into refugees, right? So there are important shifts in this, from the status quo, regardless of whether this happens. But crucially, the real import of this comparative is a temporal dimension, right? Integration and refugee acceptance is a long-run game. So you can't just make arguments about the number of people on aggregate or the sort of person that comes in to a refugee camp or into a country without considering how well they're likely to integrate in the long run. So that's what I want to do, and that's, I think, the mistake that the front half made. Okay, so let's talk about this first point. So Julia and I think, no thank you, the burdens of social integration for refugees and asylum seekers is reciprocal and symmetrical. It falls on the new state that's accepting them, and it also falls on the people coming into that state. So that looks like a requirement that you abide by the laws of that state, that you make an effort to learn the language of the state, that you have some regard, plausibly, and tolerance for the customs of people that may differ from you. That is requirements that fall on refugees, and that's a valid consideration you can make when you determine how to treat them and whether or not to take them in, right? Like, that's what, like, nations do. But crucially, like, states can ask in return for states ask for economic engagement and social involvement, right? But this sort of burden, the one that's being proposed in the government team, is not that sort of reciprocal burden that you can ask for. One reason that's true is that the people with whom you are now negotiating or bartering about what they're going to do when they come into the state aren't members of society, right? Like, you haven't given them anything, you haven't provided them anything, you haven't already, you don't exist in a relationship where that reciprocity is possible. Because these are people considering whether or not they can make it out of Syria alive. So you can't place the most onerous and incredibly high burden on them before they've even fallen into your society, before you are even in a position in which you can provide them the sorts of things that undergird that reciprocal burden, right? So that basic point about the claim that you can make isn't satisfied, and that's hugely problematic. There's a reciprocity to these things that isn't met when you place an onerous burden on people before they're members of society. I'll take back half.
You also place criteria on accepting refugees in the status quo. Why do you think those burdens, probably the same ones of some kind of conception of the language, are different from ours?
Okay, so there are two ways in which they're different. They're qualitatively different in the sense that we don't ask anyone to plausibly go back into a war zone they've come from and kill people, right? That's one important difference. Also, there's a quantitative difference given the sorts of groups that can meet the burdens that we're setting. Julie and I are asking for linguistic and economic engagement sort of burdens. It doesn't matter whether you're young. Well, it matters a little bit whether you're young. It doesn't matter whether you're old. It doesn't matter how good your health is realistically, right? That sort of thing includes virtually any person, any agent in the world, right? So that is obviously not true in your world. So that quantitative difference, obviously in our world, permits a standard of social integration that can be met by everybody. That is better, right? That's how you get refugees in who aren't only able-bodied young men of a of an ethnic group or religious background that doesn't clash with the nationalist military in that place. Okay, so integration. So look, the crucial impact of this motion is that it validates treating refugees as causal levers of the state, right? And a certain class of refugees. That, I think, is problematic for the long-run integration that you want to see in this motion, for getting asylum seekers to have a better life. So, crucially, also, it's premised on the fact that this works. I think the psychology of these refugees and what they've gone through makes it likely to believe they're not going to be the most efficacious people in the military, right? What you need to be doing in that first year is acquiring language skills and trying to integrate socially, and quite literally spending months getting your health back up from the incredible toll that being a refugee, I can imagine, takes on you. So that sort of necessary condition of long-run integration, no thank you, isn't actually met and is hindered, right? But crucially, military service doesn't necessarily provide the skills for integration afterwards, right? Those sort of things are actually undercut and presumed by Gov, right? It's presumed that these people are of fit body and mind and capable of opting into the military right away and getting a good job done. I don't think that's true, right? The way in which you can succeed in the military or whatever actually requires having the sort of conditions that refugees often don't because of the tumult that they've experienced in their life. I think that is what this what the central problem of Gov is. Okay, so very quickly on this extension, on the extension. So refugee camps exist in both worlds, right? Now, in Gov's world, they're only populated by the worst off refugees, the ones who aren't physically or mentally fit to fight in the military and to do military service, right? And also, they're now a subclass of refugees because the whole basis for Gov's case is that you need to earn respect by being seen to contribute. If you are incapable of contributing, you are now in a refugee camp in which you are a second-tier refugee. That is outrageous, right? Being a refugee alone in many of these places is to be treated in a subhuman fashion. To be below that, to be seen as a refugee who also doesn't meet the sufficient conditions of contributing to society, ensures that the people in these new camps get even worse treatment than they do now, and that is absolutely awful. Also, the thought in general that being in the military is sufficient to earn respect is wildly circular, right? We get the example that soldiers in Israel are esteemed, right? They aren't refugees. They have a condition that, crucially, the people in this motion lack. You cannot fiat in that immediately refugees will have the same treatment socially as people who aren't refugees. That is viciously circular and not helpful. Okay, and also, we get the sense that these people won't work and can't get jobs. If Gov can assume the nationalistic military will accept refugees, we can assume and offer reasons that businesses and economic agents will also do that. We are happy to oppose.
Here's my issue with the entire opposition case. They pretend like saying you should just get a job, learn this different language, adapt to our economic norms, adapt to the way we look is easy. I'm willing to say that saying you need to speak
you need to speak Turkish perfectly is also favoring people who are far more educated. There's a reason why many of the people who speak English very well in the Netherlands are highly educated, because it's easier to learn those languages. What we bring to you in CG specifically is that we think that armies are one of the few ways that they can actually integrate, that economic opportunity is not something that will simply happen, that this will also not benefit refugees. I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk firstly about integration, how we think this is going to get better, and then lastly, shortly about war. But firstly, a couple of points of rebuttal. So on this one thing that has been bothering me the entire time in UP, they tell you, but people with PTSD. I'm willing to make two claims. First of all, you can contribute to an army without having a rifle in your hand, right? We think you can still cook, you can still help with transportation, you can help with fixing cars, right? I've seen Gigi's mom. She's just as small as Gigi. Those are not people who are currently fighting in the Israeli army, right? Those are people who are contributing in other ways. Secondly, if you have severe mental health issues and are unable to contribute in the army, we think it's probably also not very good to say set up your own business and find out what's happening, right? I think the idea that severe mental health issues is going to help you build a business is simply ridiculous. They need to also deal with that, right? But then secondly, they tell you not everyone can contribute. Only looking at this room, I see women who are helping in the army, right? The idea that women can't help in the army because they're just not good at that is ridiculous and sometimes really offensive, right? Women can hold a gun and shoot people, but women can also cook, right? Even under the stereotypes that women can only do certain things, they contribute to the army. Then lastly, on the entire thing of principles, this is only based on whether you help refugees or not, right? We think reciprocity is a great idea, but if it means fucking over refugees in the process, it's probably not the right principle, right? We agree refugees should have the right to enter countries. We agree refugees should have the right to be helped. That's our entire CG case, why we think that's better done under our side of the house. So, moving on to integration. Opening government tells you, if people contribute, that's very good, and we care about that. We tell you, why do we think that the army is very specifically important? Couple of things. When opening opposition talks about over-reporting, we tell you that currently there's already over-reporting when it comes to crime. There's already over-reporting when it comes to issues with refugees. How do we solve that? Couple of things. First of all, we tell you that the army is integrated, right? You can get hero stories of this one person who saved your national security. Notice this is specifically powerful rhetoric because lots of the rhetoric around refugees is against national security. But secondly, all the crops opening opposition talks about, like special zones, like people working in different industries, are segregation. That means that you don't have interaction with these people. We provide you with a model where people can get to know each other. But moreover, we tell you that opening opposition is right. Living next to each other does not mean you know each other and care about each other. Being in the army together and having to rely on someone else to save your life does mean you trust each other for 3 reasons. First of all, you go to training together, right? We think that when you go to that not necessarily horrible, but like pretty tough period together, we think that means you can build an identity together, right? You can talk about the hierarchy, the fact that you have to run in the rain again, and that really is a bad thing. It means people are far more likely to build close relationships. Secondly, we think that because you have to trust someone with your life, you will solve possible issues. You will talk to that person from Syria about his background or her background in that area. We think that means you're far more likely to trust someone. If you just live next to each other or are in a business together, you don't have the incentive to work through those issues, right? We think that is specific to the army. Thirdly, we think that you can actually prove yourself because you're both forced to carry sandbags. We think you can prove yourself by the fact that you are working just as hard, that you're also contributing, right? You can make jokes together. We think that's a very good thing. Gigi also tells you that the military will form ties for life. I'm willing to say that all the people who've gone through 9 in-rounds together now have a bond for life. I think going through the army together, going through training together is going to be far more likely to form those bonds, which means in 40 years when you're voting, you can talk to your neighbors, you can talk about how important it was, how someone who was from another country helped you. We think those are ties that will help you push for other things. Then lastly, on business. 2 reasons why we think business is not right. First of all, because we tell you they're outcompeted in a far greater extent, right? If you're part of the military, you get the same assignments, which means you can prove yourself. If you're a business, that doesn't happen. But secondly, business is mutually exclusive. You can't get 10 bakers on your street. You can't have a very big army. That means that when you push for business, they are competitors of other people in that nation. We think that's far more likely to lead to some form of hatred. So, before I move on, I'll take opening.
The refugees who are granted asylum could join their country's new military if they wanted to. Is it that the military detests those individuals and rejects them? Or is it that former child soldiers also consider cooking for the army so morally wrong that they don't consider the benefits of getting to know their neighbours worth it?
So first of all, I think that if a couple of people do it, it's very difficult because you're going to be one person, right? We think that's a collective action problem we're breaking. Second of all, we say that maybe you're not always perfectly able to decide how you integrate best. We think that we've proven to you why this is the best reason. Third of all, we think that they're currently also not allowed, I think, to enter the army in most countries, which means that it's very difficult for them to make that decision, right? Okay, so moving on to war. Basically, what opening tells you is because you're from Syria, you're probably going to be involved in that conflict. 1, no, you left Syria because you were not involved in that conflict, right? You were not fighting for one of the actors in that conflict. And the DLO kind of concedes this, right? It says they're just walking away from bombs. They're not actually part of the conflict. Why do we think that's going to be better under our side of the house? First of all, the way Turkey is currently invading in Syria is probably very bad because they don't care about the Syrian people. We think if there's Syrian people in that army, it's going to be far more likely that they actually care about what happens in that country, right? If they want to talk about a foreign nation who has no ties in a country invading, I think that's a problem. We think it's good if people actually care, right? We think that it's far more likely people are going to be better, treating those countries far better. We think that possible intervention or involvement is going to be far better because you actually care about what's happening because people in the army actually care. Ladies and gentlemen, we think the military is unique in proving that you contribute to a country. It's also unique in forming the ties that you need for integration. That's why you don't have any other choice than vote proposition.
Major themes in this debate. Is this principally justified, and what does this do for integration? Before that, a brief mention of the third theme in this debate that I think was woefully untouched by government and thus is so small, and that is what this actually does to the conflict itself. Because recognize that any policy, even if it helps refugees, but exacerbates a conflict long run, and therefore creates more refugees, is counterproductive. So if you believe that this policy, in general, would create or exacerbate or at least not reduce the conflict, you cannot vote for it because long-term you're going to create a greater refugee problem. So OO tells us that if you arm and train these people and then they defect, that's problematic. They tell us about politicized crackdown, perception of enemy powers, no response from government. Will tells you about how this changes migratory patterns for 2 problematic reasons. First of all, he tells you that then they're more likely to stay, and I think that leads to angrier individuals who believe that no state is willing to accept them, that can exacerbate conflict. But secondly, it leads to elicit an uncontrolled migration, which is exactly the kind of migration that leads to more conflict in general. He also told you that this escalates conflict by virtue of optics, where states like Jordan, who aren't even involved in this military war, are now increasing the size of their military that probably isn't going to lead to any kind of diffusion. Now the concept of principle. I think opposition in this debate is clear and correct to say that the goal of refugee policies in general should trend to be more welcoming and more rights-based instead of more contingent. That was always the goal set out by UN policies, by groups about refugees and how we ought to treat them. The goal was never to see them as tools, and I don't think that's one that we should shift towards in politicizing and turning people into weapons. Opening government tells you that you need to contribute to the state that you entered. Several responses. Opening is uncontentious because they don't tell us how this is directly tied to military service. Secondly, they tell you that you can't afford taxation, but you should give labor instead. Several reasons, responses. First of all, that's true, but that's not contingent upon your acceptance, right? So after you are accepted, you then give to the state, but we don't ask that you tax you before you get your refugee application in, right? Like, that's coercive. So they're just saying that we should do the same thing, but with labor. So that's not an accurate comparison. Also, Will and I would say that this is better if it's tied to skills, which then can lead to long-term taxation instead of taking people who have employable skills but forcing them into the military. Lastly, labor is not equivalent to risk of death, right? So contributing to your state in terms of learning the language and adapting to the culture is not the same thing as going to the front lines. Finally, Opening told us that, well, it's better than any arbitrary factors, but this policy is also arbitrary, right? It's arbitrary in the sense of if you're willing to do this and if you have the capacity to do it, and moreover than being arbitrary, it's also coercive in saying that unless you do this, you can't get into the state, so it's wrong on two fronts. What did Will tell you? He told you about he gave you analysis, or first of all, what he told you is why this is different than other policies. First of all, he told you about why it's qualitatively different in terms of the risk and level of coercion, and that who this benefits is almost exclusively the state because they have all the power over these individuals. Up until the point you've done this military service, you have no capacity to ask anything for your state, you have no capacity to advocate for yourself. Secondly, he told you why it's quantitatively different in terms of the fact that it's not exclusionary. I think it's flippant for closing government to say, oh, well, women can do service as well in states where women are not allowed to be a part of the public order, in cases when women are excluded from that military, in cases where individuals are not allowed or integrated for religious reasons. Sure, in general that's true, but in this specific policy case, it isn't. Finally, Will told you about reciprocity, about when it takes place is hugely important, because when under this policy it becomes coercive, but when an individual and a refugee actually integrates into the state upon being accepted, that kind of contingence, that shifts to a kind of gratefulness that is more powerful. But finally, and was also unresponded to, and I think is very powerful, is that Will tells you about the unjust contingency of existence. And the reason why these refugees are refugees in the first place is that they're told that they aren't allowed to be citizens in a state by virtue of their skin color, of their religion, of where they were born. And this is exactly the same kind of principle that this policy is predicated on, that you can only be a member of the state if you opt into this service. Sure, Opening.
We explained first that many refugees, including those with incapacities, are going to be placed on the home front rather than the front line. Surely someone working in a supplies factory or local workers is more likely to integrate learn language than someone idling in a refugee camp.
Okay, so a couple things, and that moves nicely into this last concept of integration. OG's case, I think, can take two forms, right? So they say, well, they're freeloaders and now they're going to be integrated. But you have to ask, what is their role, right? So if it isn't safe, and if it's in the back lines, and if you're stirring soup because you're a woman or something, you don't get any of the benefits of optically being seen as somebody who's opting into the state and performing a service, right? But then on the other side, if you are this kind of visible person, I think that means you can be treated far more awfully and are more likely to get into harm's way. But also, I would say is that this isn't a choice, right? Like, the rest of the population isn't going to look at these refugees and say, wow, how kind of you to selflessly devote yourself to the service of the country. They see them as people who gained access into the country by doing something that regular citizens are already being selfless in doing. So I don't think this leads to the kind of narrative that refugees are people we want to accept. So now let's talk, oh, and finally, I would also say this concept, they're going to be treated well and trained well, right? You have no rights yet because you're not a long-term citizen. So if you are not treated correctly, you have no mechanism of recourse and no mechanism of advocacy. So I think it's far more likely these people will not be trained well and will just be used as pawns. So now into this weird comparative about being idle in refugee camps. Weird that they want to talk about Jordan, which is the only state that has no refugee camps, but refugees are actually integrated into cities and typically work and rent and all of those kinds of things. But three responses to this. First of all, camps still exist because there are still people who do not take this trade-off and still people who cannot take this trade-off. Will tells you that it's even worse for them because then their occupants are treated worse and they're treated as second-class refugees, a harm. Also, if Gov assumes that the military can just accept these people, I think we still get the same power to say that at least some businesses will accept them and some people will be willing to accept them. Also, so three responses to that case. Long-term, which is what we're talking about, I think it's better integration. Secondly, though, if they have the power to improve it in terms of like political capital and money to train these people, then I think we also get that on our side of the house and the ability to offer their own skills. So fourthly, about integration in the back half case. this whole introduction about Israel is bizarre, given that Arab Israelis are shut out of the military, excluded from their own communities for joining, and are treated far worse than other people, but also about this terms of hierarchy and equality. Oh, sorry, before that. Lastly, if only some people serve, they only get these benefits for a brief number of people, right? So even accepting all of their cases are true only exists for a brief number of people. First of all, I think the top can easily oppress the bottom in a military structure. In terms of an existential threat, it's far easier and more likely for these refugees to be thrown under the bus by the top. And in terms of connections, I think this just shuts out people who cannot do service and is also predicated on them doing well. Will told you why refugees can advocate for them to be treated well, and we get better integration in the long run. Proud to oppose.
Can everyone... Wait. Can everyone... Sorry, can everyone stay seated so that the judges can get out and go deliberate? Yeah. Okay.